Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. The biggest headline right now is the widening gap between Washington and Moscow over what actually came out of last year's Alaska summit. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio pushed back directly on Russian claims that any binding understanding was reached. His position is blunt. There was a proposal, not an agreement. On the Russian side, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is doing the opposite, arguing that structured proposals were effectively agreed to in principle during those meetings and should still serve as the baseline for negotiations. Why this matters is simple. This is no longer just about whether peace talks are active or stalled. It's about whether both sides are even working from the same diplomatic reality. And when that breaks down, everything downstream becomes harder. From ceasefire frameworks to prisoner exchanges to any future negotiation architecture. Now, while that diplomatic friction plays out, Ukraine's strategy is continuing to evolve in a very specific direction: sustained deep pressure inside Russia's economic and industrial system. This is not about one-off strikes or symbolic hits. It is about persistent targeting of energy infrastructure, refining capacity, chemical production, and logistics hubs that sit far from the front line. Facilities in places like Ufa and the broader industrial belt have been repeatedly struck, and the pattern is consistent: hit, repair, hit again, and force the system into constant recovery mode instead of stable production. And the effects are starting to stack up. Inside Russia, fuel supply is becoming less predictable. Prices are rising sharply in certain regions. Production is under pressure, and distribution is uneven enough that policymakers are now having to think in terms of stabilization rather than export optimization. That is a major shift for a country that normally thinks of energy as leverage, not vulnerability. Inflation is now feeding directly into that picture. Energy costs are not just a consumer issue, they are pushing up transportation, logistics, and industrial input prices. That creates pressure on the central bank, which is already navigating a complicated balancing act between supporting wartime fiscal needs and trying to prevent broader economic overheating. The policy space is narrowing, and the trade-offs are becoming more visible. Crimea is where all of this becomes very concrete. The peninsula is dealing with sustained disruption across power systems, fuel distribution, and transport connectivity. Russian-installed authorities have declared an economic emergency framework, which is essentially an acknowledgement that normal administrative tools are no longer sufficient to manage conditions on the ground. Power instability has become routine in some areas, fuel access is restricted, and rail and road logistics are being reorganized around damaged or constrained infrastructure. Even tourism, which has been used politically as a sign of stability, is under strain. What you are seeing here is not collapse, but cumulative constraint. Each system still functions, but with less flexibility and more fragility than before. Now shift north to Belarus, because this is one of the more sensitive escalation zones right now. Ukraine is increasingly focused on Belarus not as a frontline combatant, but as an enabling environment for Russian long-range strike systems. The key concern is infrastructure that supports drone navigation and targeting, especially relay systems that help guide strikes deeper into Ukrainian territory. Kyiv has already signaled that it is willing to strike those enabling assets if they continue to be used in that role. At the same time, Belarus is trying to avoid direct entry into the conflict while still maintaining its political and military alignment with Moscow. That creates a structurally unstable position, involved enough to matter, but not formally committed enough to control escalation risk. And that's where the strategic tension sits. Because once infrastructure becomes part of strike enablement, it starts to blur the line between sovereign territory and operational support space. Inside Russia itself, multiple internal pressure points are now developing at the same time. Energy strain is the most visible. Fuel disruptions and refinery pressure are no longer isolated incidents. They are showing up as systemic issues that require policy intervention. That includes discussions around export controls and domestic prioritization, which are usually emergency-level measures for a major energy exporter. But there is also a political and security layer underneath that. Internal enforcement around sabotage, espionage, and state security cases is expanding. Legal processing is becoming faster, more routine, and more opaque in some areas, with a high volume of cases tied to infrastructure sabotage or alleged cooperation with Ukrainian intelligence. The system is functioning, but it is doing so in a way that reflects long-term wartime normalization rather than short-term crisis response. Manpower is another pressure point, even if it is less visible publicly. Recruitment systems are still operating, but reports suggest uneven regional performance and increasing reliance on administrative pressure in some areas. The key signal here is not collapse, but friction, more effort required to generate the same output over time. On the battlefield, the operational picture remains consistent with what we've seen recently, but with a clear emphasis on attritional pressure rather than rapid maneuver. Russian forces continue to probe Ukrainian defensive lines with small unit tactics, incremental advances, and localized pressure points. These are not large-scale breakthroughs. They are attempts to find weak seams, exploit rotation gaps, and slowly adjust frontline geometry. Ukraine, meanwhile, is responding with layered defense systems and continued use of long-range strike capabilities to disrupt Russian logistics and staging areas before they reach the front. The intent is to slow momentum by attacking the supply chain rather than just the contact line. What that creates is a battlefield that is active, but structurally stagnant. Movement happens, but it is fragmented, expensive, and slow for both sides. Neither side is achieving decisive operational breakthrough conditions at scale. At the same time, the intelligence and security layer of the war is becoming more central than ever. Counterintelligence operations, sabotage prevention, surveillance activity, and internal security enforcement are now fully embedded into how both sides operate. This is no longer a background function. It is part of the main operating environment. There is also a parallel layer of influence activity playing out across Europe. The focus there is less about persuasion and more about disruption, increasing political friction inside decision-making systems, complicating consensus building, and raising the cost of alignment on Ukraine policy. And at the alliance level, Europe is continuing to move toward longer-term structural support for Ukraine. The emphasis is shifting from short-term emergency assistance towards sustained financing and industrial capacity planning. That signals a longer conflict horizon being baked into policy assumptions, even if no one is explicitly saying it that way. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Wishing you a wonderful weekend.